In this video, we will further expand on our initial web service data flow, and in doing so, review how to both clone and create custom app reference modules. Let's log into the platform and navigate to the search page. Here, we can use the filters provided on the left to find the resource that we want to start with. Let's search for the web service data flow we created previously and select the option to open up this data flow in the DataFlow Designer. As you may recall from the previous video, we created this simple data flow to provide an API endpoint to users that want to query our New York City taxi trip dataset and request several records from this dataset. We have our data source modules, which are effectively a flat CSV file in this example. We then apply some data transformation in this case, selecting just one column, and we then convert the data into a JSON formatted data set with the table to JSON module. Finally, we have our web receive and web send modules that act as our web service activators, along with the parameter parser to parse out the URL parameter for the number of records. Here, let's assume we want to create several versions of this web service. Each version will return a different column of our data set. We can, of course, create another URL parameter and add another parser and pipe it into the table column reducer module. That's a completely appropriate approach and can be done quickly. However, in this case, let's take another approach where we use nested data flows, also called custom app reference modules. With this more advanced approach, we can have additional flexibility in how we design our web service endpoints, including more granularity on version upgrades, permissions, and authentication. The first step we will take is to create a custom module, what is also called an app reference module, from a section of our data flow. Composable makes it easy to create custom app reference modules, which serve as reusable modules. Simply select the modules and right-click to show the module context menu, and select Create Data Flow from Selection. We're only going to select these modules in the center, which are essentially the unit of managed code of the web service. So by selecting and clicking Create Data Flow from Selection, Composable generates a new data flow for you, which encapsulates the modules and externalizes the inputs and outputs. This is now what we call an app reference module or a nested data flow. I can click on the module name and open up the nested data flow. Note, it essentially includes the modules we selected in our parent data flow, along with external input and output modules that Composable generated for us to externalize the inputs and outputs. You can see here that this module is already saved for us. We don't need to make any changes, other than perhaps providing a new data flow name. Now, let's use the clone feature. The clone feature exists across a number of Composable resources, including data flows and query views. It's a quick way to copy or clone the resource, and then be able to make any changes to the resource and save it. It's especially useful if you are collaborating with other users and want to clone a resource they may have created and modify it to satisfy your requirements. The Designer toolbar provides a clone button. Clicking it will refresh the Designer window with a cloned copy of the data flow, but this data flow is not saved yet. The data flow name was updated for me with this copy text, and there is no data flow ID yet for this data flow. Before we save the data flow, let's update the logic of this data flow. In this case, we can simply type in another column to return, for example, fair amount. Now, let's update the name of the data flow. We can then save this data flow, and you will see here that the saved data flow has a new unique ID. Let's go through these steps again. Let's click Clone to clone the module. Let's then update the logic to select another column. For example, we can put in total amount. We can then rename the data flow and save as well. So now we essentially have 3 data flows that we can use as app reference modules. Let's go to the search page to see these 3 data flows. The first is the original one that we created, using the Create Data Flow from Selection option in the module context window, and 2 other data flows that were created using the clone feature. Let's go back to our parent web service data flow and modify it so that the web service supports a number of versions or code paths. In our data flow, we will not be executing this app reference module directly, since we want to dynamically route to one of the 3 we created. So let me remove this module from the canvas by clicking on the X icon to close it. Our goal is to have this data flow serve as a single web service, meaning we would provide just this HTTP endpoint to the API consumers. We will add an additional parameter called version to signal the routing we will define next. To review, the HTTP endpoint is made up of usual URL stem specifying the composable instance, followed by the web activation service location, followed by the app ID or app handle, and an optional list of one or more parameters. We will dynamically route across different code paths with the help of the Dynamic App Reference module. Let me search for the Dynamic App Reference module in the module palette and drag and drop it onto the canvas. The Dynamic App Reference module accepts a list of key value pairs for the inputs to the nested data flow. Remember that we have this additional parameter called records to specify the number of returned records. So let's add a key value pair module to the canvas. The key value pair module allows us to quickly define key value pairs. The key here will be the ending row for the CSV reader module, and the value will be piped into from the parameter parser module. The Dynamic App Reference module also takes in the dataflow application ID that will be executed, and you can find this dataflow ID in a number of places, but only if the dataflow is saved. For example, it appears here in the designer on the right-hand side or on the dataflow details page. After the web receive module, we would use the parameter parser module to parse out the parameters, as we did previously. So let me add a new parameter parser module for the version parameter and provide a default, let's say v1. We can branch on this parameter value, for example, using an if-else module or a branch module. Both are available in the module palette and can be utilized here. However, a more complex routing pattern to support several code paths can be done more efficiently in another way, as I will demonstrate. This preferred approach utilizes a number of new modules that I will bring onto the canvas and introduce. But first, let me create a set of 3 key value pairs using 3 key value pair modules. These key value pairs will allow me to associate a key, in this case, the version parameter, with a value that we will provide. So let me type in v1 and v2 and v3 into the key inputs on these modules, and these will correspond to the 3 different data flows we created that return different columns of our data set. So we now have to set the value corresponding to each key to the dataflow ID of each of the data flows we previously created. I'll open up the search page in a new tab, and from there also open up each of the corresponding dataflow details pages in new tabs. This way I can see the dataflow overview, copy the dataflow ID, and paste it in as values in the key value pair modules. So let's finish doing that for all 3 data flows and each of the key value pair modules. Once we have these ready, we will use a module called the named Dictionary Creator module. Let me search for this module and drag it onto the canvas. The named Dictionary Creator module creates a dictionary out of multiple key value pairs. That means I can pipe in all of the key value pair modules to generate a dictionary. We will then use the Data Binder Evaluator module. I'll search for this module in the palette and drag it onto the canvas. The Data Binder Evaluator module is a useful module that allows you to evaluate an expression at runtime against a given object. The container input is the object reference against which the expression is evaluated, which in this case is our dictionary that we pipe in from the named Dictionary Creator module. The expression input is the navigation path on the container. In this case, it will be the version parameter, since we will look up the version parameter in the dictionary to pick out the correct value from the multiple key value pairs. Since the version parameter will simply be v1, v2, v3, and so on, the expression needs to be slightly formatted. So we can use the string formatter module for this. This provides us with string formatting capability. So we will pass in the parameter and just reference it with curly braces and enclose it in brackets for the Data Binder Evaluator module expression input. Finally, we can pipe in the output from the Data Binder Evaluator module into the Dynamic App Reference module. In this way, we have a more scalable and dynamic approach to referencing different data flows. When you want to add a new option, you can just add another key value pair to the dictionary, where the key is the parameter and value is the data flow application ID. We now have to return a response in this data flow. We can do that with the help of 2 additional Data Binder Evaluator modules. We will set one to be for response in and one for status code. So I will type these into each expression. You can have additional Data Binder Evaluator modules for the content type and header as well, if you expect those to change. We can then simply pipe these values into the appropriate inputs in the web sent module. Let me take a moment to rearrange the modules and better organize the designer canvas areas. So, to review, this URL would be your web service endpoint data flow, which you would update with new routes. For example, if I want to add a version 4, each version is supported by its own nested data flow, executed by the dynamic app reference module. Because each code path is encapsulated in each own data flow, each request will appear in the corresponding run history page, with each data flow also having its own version control history, its own permissions, settings, and so on. That means that the web service can be better controlled, monitored, and maintained in the long run. We hope you enjoyed watching this video. Please reference additional tutorials on our documentation pages.